Good evening, everyone. All right. Great crowd. That's fantastic. Well, welcome everyone to the 4th annual EugeneJ.McCarthy lecture featuring Minnesota's senior senator, Amy Klobuchar. My name is Matt Lindstrom, and it is a privilege to direct the McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement at St. John's and hold the Ed Henry Professorship at Political Science at St. Ben's and St. John's. We're very pleased to host Senator Klobuchar this evening and really appreciate her willingness to spend so much time on campus with our community. We will get to Senator Klobuchar's address shortly, but let me just first tell you a little bit about the lecture and the McCarthy Center. In a few minutes, St. John's President, Father Bob Koopman, will follow, and I will briefly introduce Senator Dave Durenberger in a minute, who will introduce our McCarthy lecturer. These are bright lights. Big city, bright lights. Gene McCarthy came to St. John's when he was 15 years old to complete the prep school, and he graduated from St. John's University when he was 19 years old. This is also while starring as a hockey player during the pre-helmet days and a baseball player. That's 19 years old, students, so keep note of that. High expectations. In 1948, Gene McCarthy entered the United States House of Representatives, where he served for 10 years. And in 1958, he was elected United States Senator from Minnesota, a position he held for two terms. Senator McCarthy is widely credited with changing the face of American politics in 1968 when he ran for president on an anti-Vietnam War platform. While he did not win the nomination, his courage gave voice to countless supporters, especially newly engaged young Americans like many of you in the audience this evening. I hope that you had a chance to view some of the slides on the PowerPoint this evening that St. John's archivist Peggy Roski so skillfully put together, and thank you very much, Peggy, for that. And if you didn't see the slideshow, it is on the McCarthy Center website. The McCarthy Center's mission is to serve the students of St. Ben's and St. John's who continue to build on our institutional traditions of civic-minded graduates. It doesn't take too long to walk the halls of St. Paul Capitol or D.C. Capitol to find our graduates, young and older, serving our country and our state. Through internship programs, student alum mentoring programs, scholarships, conferences, campus speakers, 2 professorships, the McCarthy Center strives to be a resource for civic engagement on and off campus. Partnering with the St. Ben's St. John's Political Science Department, we recently completed the 31st year of the Washington, D.C. Summer Study Program. 31 years. In fact, in today's Washington Post, there's an article about internship programs. Check it out. And it talks about a number of sort of for-profit internship programs. And unfortunately, we're not mentioned. We should have been. But you read that, and it really speaks to the importance of our own internship program that we have on these 2 campuses. And in their full-time internships and group seminars this summer, students met Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, cabinet secretaries. Some protested for and against tax cuts. They wrote blogs, tweets, constituent letters, House and Senate speeches, and one student was actually even interviewed and quoted extensively for a feature story in Time magazine. And while there were many highlights this summer, one of the more exciting times was when the group got to meet with the president's top national security advisor, and happens to be my classmate from St. John's, Dennis McDonough. We kind of took advantage of his boss being up in Canada at the G20 summit, and so we spent about an hour in the Situation Room and had an extensive tour of the West Wing, which was quite marvelous. This summer, the McCarthy Center also partnered with the award-winning Marie and Robert Jackson Fellowship Program at St. Ben's, which provides leadership training and scholarships to students at St. John's and St. Ben's who work in the public sphere or direct community service. This is a very selective group of students, and they provided very critical support for a variety of nonprofit and government sites throughout Minnesota as well as South Dakota. Moving forward this fall, the McCarthy Center will continue our very popular Politics and a Pint series in famous Brother Willie's Pub over here. We'll also host the Mark Kennedy Lecture Series, among other programs. And this spring, I'm very proud to announce that the McCarthy Residency will feature Kathleen Hall Jameson, a graduate of St. Ben's Prep. Maybe you didn't even know there was a St. Ben's Prep, but there was. St. Ben's Prep, and she's also the director of the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Public Policy Center. So check us out online. We now have a Twitter feed, page, whatever it's called. Check that out. We have Facebook. We have all this sort of stuff. So check it out. It's worth it. So these are really exciting times for our schools, for the country, and the world. Thank you very much for attending tonight. Thank you for your support. I now want to welcome St. John's President, Father Bob Koopman, to the podium.
Thank you, Matt. Good evening and welcome to all of you, faculty, staff, students, and guests of St. John's. We're honored to have some very distinguished, all of you are distinguished, of course, but some particularly distinguished people. One of them is one of my bosses, and that's Ann Huntrod. She's the chair of the St. John's Board of Regents. Ann, where are you here? There she is. Welcome. And then I want to welcome the 1,046 first-year students that we welcomed to St. John's and St. Ben's just this past week. For all of you, and I know there's a whole nother room, people watching this on closed circuit. Many people have sat in your seats pursuing wisdom, and tonight we honor one of our most notable. So I'm honored to take part in this evening's celebration of the late Senator Eugene McCarthy. I actually visited with him many times, all the way back to when I was a student and until not so long before he passed away. And we're pleased to have several family members and close friends of Senator McCarthy with us this evening, including his sister-in-law, Muriel McCarthy. Muriel, where are you out here? Welcome, and welcome to all of the McCarthys. So this lecture in honor of Senator McCarthy seeks to inspire a new generation of young people, many of you out here, to pursue fresh ideas, to challenge the status quo, and you can do it, to effect positive change in your communities, and like McCarthy himself, to lead with honesty, integrity, and courage. Before we introduce our speaker, I would also like to especially acknowledge Dan and Catherine Whalen for their generous contribution, which establishes this Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, and which hosts this lecture. So thank you, Catherine and Dan. And now Matt Lindstrom will introduce Senator Dave Durenberger.
Well, many observers of St. Ben's and St. John's have remarked that due to the Bennies and Johnnies in public service, there must be something in the water up here. So what then does this say about our friend Senator Dave Durenberger, who spent his childhood growing up in Flingtown as the son of former SJU athletic director George Durenberger, the guy, by the way, who hired a coach named John Gallardi? Yeah, that was a great move. And Jim, that's right, Jim Smith, fantastic. Well, clearly the tradition of Benedictine service has indeed influenced Senator Durenberger, as he has spent the last 30 years as a public servant. twice elected to the United States Senate, Senator Durenberger found his passion serving as the chairman of the Health Subcommittee of the Senate Finance Committee. And since leaving the Senate, he has been named Senior Health Policy Fellow at the University of St. Thomas and also chairs their National Institute of Health Policy through the Opus College of Business. But I am confident that he still roots for the Johnnies, I believe. Yeah. Dave, will you please join us, come to the podium and introduce Senator Klobuchar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. A special thanks to Matt for the introduction, and Bob Koopman, thank you for your service. I have the opportunity to introduce a person for whom I gain more respect every day. And unless she gets away with the idea of thinking that it's the water up here, it's actually the beer. In fact, many of us were baptized in it because it's the sort of like the Bavarian tradition in this place. I do cheer for the St. Thomas Law School football team, which there isn't one. But I'm here to introduce my friend Amy. But let me do it by saying I first met Eugene.McCarthy when I was about 5 years old. It was in 1939. I was a little toddler. Gene was, my dad was coaching everything those days, including the hockey team, so he asked Gene to be an assistant coach, and Gene volunteered to do that, and it quickly turned out that Gene had actually played the sport, which my father hadn't. So my dad was smart enough to promote him quickly to the head coach job, from which he gained all kinds of fame. Little did I know that 42 years later, I think it was, Gene enlisted in the Democratic or DFL primary in Minnesota to run against me. And I thought, my God, he owes his job to my father. What is this? Taking mine away from me. Well, he justified it in two ways. One was, as only McCarthy could do, he said, never trust anybody that insists on having a bulkhead aisle seat in an airplane, which is a non sequitur, but that never made any difference to Eugene.McCarthy. The second was, and this is the point of this introduction, the second was that most accidents happen in the middle of the road. Now, Gene was far to the left of me, and some people will go unnamed, or far to the right of me, and there's a growing consensus in America that one of the problems in this country today is that we have been spending too much time honoring right or left and not enough time sort of looking at where the middle is. And I wanted to make that point in introducing Amy because before he died, Russell Fridley, who was the president of the Minnesota Historical Society, told me that, encouraged me to write a book on the Minnesota Republicans, and I said, oh my God. He said, well, before the good ones all die. But the point he was making is that two parts. Number one, Minnesota was basically a Republican state until the arrival of Hubert Humphrey, and the power of that man made us re-examine who we were as a state. And many of us are Democrats, many of us are Republicans, many of us are independents. But all of us, Russell said, are progressives. All of us. Ted Metow, who was one of the better political scientists in this state, wrote a book in 1970 about how progressive both of our parties were. And he compared the party platforms, the DFL party and the Republican Party. And he said they're practically identical. And they all have transportation and education and health care and environment and energy and everything people care about are in these platforms. Now, one party starts at the solution to defining the problems and the solutions just from the left of center, and the other party comes at it more from the right of center, a more conservative approach. But that's what was unique about Minnesota, and it still is unique about Minnesota. I won't try to define Amy Klobuchar for you here tonight. She will do that herself, and she will do it in the next couple of years because, God willing, she will be running for re-election. At the same time as her very, very good friend, Barack Obama, is running for re-election as President of the United States, should he choose to do that. But I did not know Amy Klobuchar when I was 3 years old. I didn't know her when she was 3 years old, for that matter. But I know where she's from, and I know what she's done with her life. I know she's been a high achiever in everything that she's attended, from valedictorian of her high school class at Wayzata High School to a magna cum laude graduate at Yale, and we could go on with the honors. But the greatest honor is that people who meet Amy Klobuchar, whether it's in Washington, D.C., or Syria, or some other places that you've been around the world, or back home in places like Ely or Collegeville, wherever it may be, are impressed. I think they're impressed by her fairness, the way in which she approaches problems, the way in which she defines problems, and the way in which she seeks solutions to those problems. I, having served 3 terms in the United States Senate, love the United States Senate. And I honor everybody who has ever had the opportunity to serve there. So it is an incredible opportunity for me as a graduate of this university to say I owe it to my family, I owe it to St. John's, that I had the opportunity of public service in this way. And that I carried away from it a respect for everyone else who seeks that office. Tonight, we have the opportunity to listen to and to converse with, when we get to that part of the evening, with a very unique person. We all know unique in the sense of first woman from Minnesota elected to the United States Senate. But she's so unique in so many other respects, including the fact that she comes in the same class as a lot of other people we haven't heard a lot from on the national scene, because they are shaping where this country will be 2, 4, 6, or 8 years from now. It will not be the divided country we're experiencing today. It will be a different country. It will be a country like we in Minnesota believe the United States of America, with all its exceptionalism and all its uniqueness and all of its constant stream of wonderful immigrants, can always be. So it's an honor for me to introduce to this audience my friend, Amy Klobuchar.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Senator Durenberger, for that beautiful introduction. As you can see, in your honor, I wore Johnny Red. Okay, right? I got the memo. Thank you, Father Bob, for your leadership. It has been just engaging to talk with you earlier this evening. Members of the McCarthy family, it's an honor to be here with you. And again, Senator Durenberger, thank you for that very, very nice introduction. I have to say it was a little bit of a step up from the amusing introduction I got a few months ago when Chief Judge Davis, who's a good friend, introduced me at the swearing in of our brand new federal marshal in front of hundreds of people, and he gave this very nice introduction. It was getting to the main point, and he said, "I give to you Minnesota's senior citizen." That's the truth. That truly happened to me. Dave Durenberger gave me such good advice when I won my election and was headed to the Senate. He has been a mentor since then, such a leader on health care. A lot of the ideas that he has talked about bringing costs in and figuring out new ways to deliver health care have been so helpful for me in the last few years. And it was fun to hear about, of course, his long tradition going back at St. John's. The other thing about Dave was that one of the things he suggested to me when we had a very meaningful breakfast for me right before I got to the Senate was getting involved in the prayer breakfast at the Senate. And I actually started to go, and as it can happen to anyone, as you know, who shows up at things, suddenly after about a year I found myself co-chairing the prayer breakfast to the United States Senate with Republican Senator Johnny Isakson from Georgia. And it's really been one of the best experiences that I've had in a somewhat partisan era, as Senator Durenberger mentioned. It is truly an opportunity to build friendships that might not otherwise be possible, and it's a welcome respite from the day-to-day quarrels and strategic maneuvers of Washington. Senator Durenberger, the other thing he did that I have always loved about him, and that I always tell everyone that comes to our office, and by the way, you're all invited every Thursday morning when the Senate's in session. We invite the entire state of Minnesota to breakfast. And we usually have over 100 people. And if you come into the lobby of our office and in the front area in the conference room, you'll see a set of photos that are proudly hanging there. And they are a set of photos of all of Minnesota's senators, and they were given to me by Dave Durenberger. And our office actually did some research, and we came up with the bios for all of these senators, and they make quite a collection. We have a portrait of James Shields from St. Paul, who was one of Minnesota's very first two senators. He also has the distinction of having challenged none other than Abraham Lincoln to a duel in 1842, and luckily for the reputation of our brand new state, not to mention the State of the Union, that duel, which was to take place on an island in the Mississippi River, was happily canceled. We also have Senator Magnus Johnson from Litchfield, who had such a heavy Swedish accent that his colleagues in the United States Senate referred to him as generally speaking Janssen. We have Rudy Boswich, who actually, Dave, emailed me the other day about something. We went back and forth from my hometown of Plymouth. He was known as the matchmaker of the Capitol Hill because he used to throw parties for Single Hill staffers looking to settle down, and they worked, and he has an entire collection of wedding announcements and birth certificates from couples that met at his party. And then, of course, we have Eugene.McCarthy, who's staring out of his picture frame with this smile that can only be described as wry. It's funny because the bio that we included long before I ever thought I would be invited to give this talk actually talks about McCarthy's wicked sense of humor and mentions his old Senate nickname. They called him the Needle, a nod to his piercing wit. I can tell you it's a lot better than generally speaking Janssen. So I walk by Eugene McCarthy almost every day, and it's an enormous honor to be giving a lecture about him here at his favorite school. St. John's is a Minnesota institution, and not just because it boasts such distinguished alums as David Durenberger and Eugene McCarthy. This is a university that not only educates its students, but trains them to be global citizens. Each year, St. John's and St. Ben's, okay, there we go. I was waiting to mention it. Ranked near the top of all undergraduate colleges in the percentage of students who study abroad, and have been home to a number of leaders at two institutions in the modern world of diplomacy and foreign policy. There's Dennis McDonough, as was mentioned, a football star from the class of 1992, who now serves as chief of staff for the National Security Council. And as the New York Times recently recounted, he is, quote, so close to the president that colleagues, even his superiors, often do not make a major move without first checking with him. And then there's Miguel Diaz, who is serving as the United States ambassador to the Holy See. Of course, at the time of his nomination, he was a professor of theology here, and I was honored to introduce him at his confirmation hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As I said that day, Professor Diaz is a faithful Catholic, a gifted theologian, a respected scholar, a natural teacher, and a dedicated bridge builder. He knows and loves America, and he knows and loves the Catholic Church. As I also said that day, Miguel Diaz loves his family, And I know that well because he was so frustrated by the length of the confirmation process that he threatened to bring his entire family, including all 4 of his children, to the United States Capitol grounds to camp out if we didn't get him confirmed before the start of his children's school year in Rome. He may be a tenacious diplomat, but he is an even more tenacious father. The kids started school on time. Both Dennis McDonough and Ambassador Diaz are recent examples of how St. John's and St. Ben's have always provided their students with a rigorous education and prepared both students and teachers for leadership positions. No wonder I always try to hire your graduates. It's not just because they bring me Johnny bread, which they do. So I am so glad to be here on campus and to participate in this lecture series in memory of Eugene McCarthy and his dedication to conscience and courage in public life. A lot of words have been used to describe Eugene McCarthy throughout the course of his career. Conventional was never one of them. In a business where rhetoric can often cloud reality, he called a spade a spade. He was a maverick before maverick was a campaign slogan. He went rogue before Sarah Palin had even shot her first moose. The truth is that we call McCarthy a maverick because he never backed down from a challenge. At a time when other members of Congress shied away from confronting the other McCarthy, that would be Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin, our Minnesota McCarthy was willing to meet him head-to-head in a televised debate. And as it turns out, the Wisconsin McCarthy was the more intimidated of the two. According to one biography of Eugene McCarthy, the Wisconsin senator called the Minnesota congressman the night before the debate with a simple request: let's not get into an Irish brawl. Of course, Eugene McCarthy was not the kind to get into a fistfight. Words were his weapon of choice, and they helped him emerge from the debate unscathed. Up until that point, no other member of Congress had been willing to take on Joseph McCarthy because, as commentator Harry MacArthur put it in a 1952 newspaper column, he was a fearsome opponent. Joseph McCarthy's manner aggravates people. The result is that he usually reaches the end of one of those debates seeming a calm, reasonable, even persecuted man, while his opponent is reduced to incoherent rage. But Eugene McCarthy, MacArthur added, seems to have found the formula. While there was probably no true victor in the debate, Eugene McCarthy emerged unruffled and unscarred. This is tantamount to victory in this league. In the history books, Eugene McCarthy is identified with one cause, the Vietnam War, with 1 year, 1968, and with one event, the New Hampshire Democratic primary, where his strong showing caused President Johnson to announce only days after that primary that he would not seek re-election. This was one of the toughest periods in our nation's history. But it wasn't just the war in Vietnam, and it wasn't just the violence and unrest in America's cities. It was broader and deeper. A breakdown of the public's trust in our own government, a growing feeling of alienation by Americans against our institutions and our leaders. Eugene McCarthy understood what a serious threat this was to our democratic form of government, which requires informed and engaged citizens who are able to hold their government accountable. This challenge is still very much with us today. I want to step back from that singular perspective of 1968, which has dominated how Eugene McCarthy is traditionally viewed. Instead, let's fast forward from 1968 to the current time. It's fair to say that we too are living in one of the toughest periods in America's history. We have to go back decades, to a decade like the 60s, to find a time when we were confronted by so many issues that will determine the course of our nation. From 2 difficult wars to an economy which last year teetered on the edge of a cliff and is still fragile but at least stable, to a dependence on foreign oil that creates instability for our national security and economy, to the crushing weight of a national debt that threatens to impoverish generations to come. In the midst of all this, we can't simply rely on exhausted ideas from the past or outdated political paradigms. This is not the time to put our heads in the sand. This is the time to meet these challenges head on. We need to debate new ideas and forge new political models that are best suited for the challenges of these times. We need to make decisions that go beyond the next election to the next generation. History will judge whether we are right or wrong, timid or courageous. During another challenging time in America's history, President Abraham Lincoln once said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew." And today we are in a time when we must think anew and act anew. This is also what Eugene McCarthy did. So I'd like to focus my remarks on this question. What can we learn from Eugene McCarthy's spirit and career in public service to help guide us today in the year 2010 and beyond? In particular, I want to focus on three things that I think were very dear to Senator McCarthy: education, internationalism, and an independent spirit. He took education seriously. He took the world seriously. He took his independence seriously. And in light of the Twins' current exciting season, I should note that he took his baseball seriously too. Now, first there's education. Eugene McCarthy grew up in the small town of Watkins, just 25 miles south of here. He came of age during the Great Depression. His own family suffered, and he watched as many other families suffered during that very difficult time. While he may not have grown up with material wealth, he did grow up with something even more valuable: a love of education. His family recognized that and made sure that he had the opportunity to study here at St. John's. St. John's, of course, had an enormous influence on McCarthy. It transformed him from a man of ideas and a man of action. As a politician, he sometimes looked like a man of ideas trapped inside a man of action. And it's funny because my dad, who was a journalist, and actually my dad, Jim Klobuchar, and his wife, Susan, are here with us today. I don't think he knew that I found this column from 1974, but I'm very resourceful. My dad, who was a journalist during much of McCarthy's political career, actually wrote that very thing about him being a man of ideas trapped inside a man of action back in 1974. McCarthy was already out of the Senate at that point. People were speculating that he might run for the House seat right here in the 6th Congressional District. Republican Representative John Zwock had stepped down in the wake of Watergate. And as my dad put it in his column in the old Minneapolis Star, McCarthy replacing Zwock would be like Socrates succeeding Mr. Chips in the next semester. My dad's column, his column went on to ask, are the 6th District and Eugene McCarthy ready for each other? Can a man who unhorsed Lyndon Johnson, deflated Senate windbags, electrified the Georgetown Cocktail League, and occasionally showed up for roll call votes, find contentment campaigning in Mudgett and Pulaski? Have Piers, Motley, and Malacca read Mr. McCarthy's poem, Lament of an Aging Politician? Is there a boom in Stearns County for poet-philosophers? Well, McCarthy's education gave him a parliamentary eloquence that is now rare in the Senate, especially with the recent passing of Senator Robert Byrd, who is the last surviving member of the Senate class of 1958 to which McCarthy belonged. Despite what one prominent historian has called the anti-intellectualism of American life, McCarthy was never afraid to show his strong intellect or apply his excellent education or bring his formidable mind to bear on the issues of the day. McCarthy's education helped to inoculate him against demagoguery. The demagogue, he said, was concerned not with truth, but only with his own power and influence. Oh, what would he think of today's 24-hour shout fests on cable TV? The one-sentence sound bites, the political arguments reduced to 140-character tweets. I would guess he would be somewhat appalled. Eugene.McCarthy, after all, could effortlessly recite the poetry of Dylan Thomas or Robert Lowell, or allude to the writings of George Orwell in the course of a political discussion. And what would he think of today's hyperpartisanship, the lockstep party voting, the threat of a filibuster on practically every vote? I think he would be appalled by that too. After all, McCarthy had intellectual friends across the political spectrum, including notable conservatives like James J. Kilpatrick, William F. Buckley, and Barry Goldwater. As someone who came from a humble, small-town background, McCarthy knew that education was the ticket to the world. It certainly was for him. Education is the gateway to economic opportunity for the individual, but it's also the foundation of economic prosperity and progress for our country today. I want to highlight this second point, the importance of education for the well-being of our country. Columnist David Brooks, somewhat conservative columnist David Brooks, has written a lot about this recently. He calls education America's biggest challenge, and he's right. Why did the United States become the leading economic power of the 20th century? Brooks asks. The best short answer, he says, is that a ferocious belief that people have the power to transform their own lives gave Americans an unparalleled commitment to education, hard work, and economic freedom. In 1890, the average American adult had completed about 8 years of schooling. By 1900, the average American had 8.8 years. By 1910, it was 9.6 years. By 1960, it was nearly 14 years. Now, quantity doesn't always equal quality, but I think we can accept that these numbers represent tremendous educational progress, and it fueled our economic progress too. As Brooks said in a recent column, American leaders expanded education, created the highest quality workforce on the planet. That quality workforce was the single biggest reason the U.S. emerged as the economic superpower of the 20th century. Generation after generation, American workers were better educated, more industrious, and more innovative than the ones that came before. But, and this gets to our challenge, that progress has stagnated since the 1970s. Meanwhile, other nations have forged ahead. A recent study found that the U.S. has fallen behind 11 countries in our proportion of college graduates. At least Minnesota ranks near the top in the United States. Of the 30 industrialized countries, American students rank 25th in math and 21st in science. In the U.S., only 1/3 of college students earn bachelor's degrees in science and engineering. In Japan, it's 63%. In China, it's 53%. While a recent study puts the U.S. in 6th place out of 40 nations for innovation, capacity, and internal competitiveness, we're in last place for our efforts to increase innovation and competitiveness. Now, I have some of my own ideas for a national competitiveness agenda, which I have been pushing in Washington. We need to be a nation that makes stuff again, that thinks again, that exports to the world. We need to focus on, as former Minnesota native and New York Times columnist Tom Friedman calls, nation building in our own nation. By this, I mean clear and consistent research and development incentives, a better process for commercializing university research and taking it to market, allowing kids from foreign countries who graduate from our colleges and universities to stay in this country, increasing our emphasis on exports. But we can save that for the questions and answers and when I get invited back another time. Oh, thank you. I've got one person with me. Now, what I want to focus on right now is a critical part of that innovation agenda, and that is education. The idea that innovation and economic progress are only fostered when we have an education system that taps into the creativity and curiosity of our young people. Earlier this year, I went to my daughter's 9th grade science fair, and in fact, she is right here. Abigail's here with us today. And we loaded up the family car with her 9th grade experiment, which was measuring the amount of bacteria in pre-washed and washed lettuce. I will tell you that when she presented it to the judges, she looked straight in their eyes and said, "I have one piece of advice for you, wash your lettuce." Well, I left that science fair that day in awe of the intensity of these high school students and their ability to think outside of the box. They have the curiosity to learn and the determination to compete. But that energy and creative thinking cannot be left on the stage of the 9th grade science fair ceremony. Do you remember the opening ceremonies of those Beijing Olympics a few years back, the Summer Olympics? Well, I remember them because what I most remember about them is that perfectly synchronized 2,000-man drumming routine. I watched that and I thought, we're in trouble, because those drum beats are only getting louder and louder. And while China builds the world's leading solar energy industry, we are still bickering about energy in Washington. While India encourages invention and entrepreneurship, we're giving our innovators the runaround, playing red light, green light with tax incentives. And while Brazil produces more engineers, we watch as our students fall behind. The world is moving fast, and we can't let it pass us by. And I want to emphasize that this is not all about education in science, technology, engineering, and math. Our young people also need a thorough grounding in history, languages, and the humanities. And in fact, that was the point of the David Brooks column that I just quoted. Unfortunately, there has been nearly a 50% drop in the portion of liberal arts majors over the past generation. It doesn't do us much good for students to graduate with science or engineering degrees if they lack the ability to read with fluency, write with clarity, or think with imagination. Someone who gets a narrow education also risks having a narrow mind. So what lessons... So what lessons do we learn from McCarthy's focus on education? If the lesson of real estate is location, 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 then the lesson of today's global marketplace is education, education, education. Education in school, in the workforce, and certainly a more honest and educated discussion in the political arena. Eugene McCarthy's own education was the opposite of narrow, and it's what made him such a distinctive leader. He used his education as a sword, and unlike most politicians, he didn't suffer fools gladly. Another way McCarthy bucked conventional wisdom was through foreign policy. Here, too, his example can be instructive for us today. History books often portray McCarthy as a one-dimensional figure, as the candidate who opposed a war and brought down a president. But if there's one thing you can say about Eugene McCarthy, it's that he was not one-dimensional. McCarthy still believed in a strong and vital international role for the United States. The lesson from Vietnam was not that the United States should simply retreat from the world. Instead, he wanted Americans to act responsibly, consistent with our values and our national interests. This may seem sensible and obvious to us now, but when McCarthy first went to Washington in 1948, many parts of Minnesota were still strongholds of isolationism. In 1922, Minnesotans elected Henrik Shipstead, which I should note, if you visit our office, he has the worst hair of any senator in Minnesota. Minnesotans elected Henrik Shipstead to the Senate, where he cast one of only 2 votes opposing the League of Nations Charter. For those of you wondering who cast the other no vote, it was a senator from North Dakota. And then there was Harold Knudsen, the congressman from our state, who bitterly opposed the Marshall Plan after World War II and instead suggested we, quote, give Europe a paddle and tell them, go paddle your own canoe. Eugene.McCarthy took a much different approach. He was part of a new generation of Minnesota leaders, bipartisan leaders including Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, Harold Stass, and Bill Frenzel, who believed in things like arms control, international trade, global engagement, and international organizations like the UN and NATO. In part, this more worldly perspective reflected the times. After the experience of the Second World War, it was much harder for Minnesotans to feel detached from the world. But McCarthy's worldview also reflected something deeper and more basic for him, something that reflected his education and experience right here in St. John's. And that was his core value as a Christian. As he said in 1963, morality does not stop at the water's edge. Ethical principles bear strongly on foreign relations, and we have never accepted that national interests can ultimately override right and wrong. McCarthy's worldview also reflected one more thing, and that was his service on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee under the chairmanship of the legendary William Fulbright. It was a long way from Watkins, Minnesota. As a coincidence, during his tenure on the committee, there was a young staff intern who was from another small town in America. You may have heard of him. His name was Bill Clinton. And he came from Senator Fulbright's home state of Arkansas. As president, Clinton spoke at McCarthy's funeral in 1996, and I actually talked to President Clinton about this at the recent Starkey Lab Foundation charity event about a month ago. And after that, he sent me a copy of his eulogy that he gave for McCarthy. And in that eulogy, he described this encounter. The year was 1970, and Clinton was fresh out of college. He was invited to a fancy black-tie dinner in Washington, so he rented a tux. But after he did that, he realized he didn't have any black dress shoes to match. Fortunately, Clinton learned that a friend of his had a friend who wore his same shoe size, and that was Eugene McCarthy. So that night, the future president from Hope, Arkansas, had the distinction of wearing Eugene McCarthy's shoes to a party where none other than President Richard Nixon was in the receiving line. How would you like to have been a fly on the wall at that party? The Senate Foreign Relations Committee provided a stage for McCarthy, first to question and then to oppose American policy in Vietnam. But the position also allowed him to more fully pursue his interest in other foreign policy matters, including arms control and the oversight of the CIA. McCarthy believed the CIA had grossly overstepped its bounds in both the Bay of Pigs debacle and the invasion of the Dominican Republic. He saw the agency becoming its own form of, in his words, invisible government answerable only to itself. McCarthy believed the CIA at that time, that their reckless adventurism was its own mutant strain of isolationism. It was different from the kind that Hendrik Shipstead and Harold Knudsen had practiced, but it was isolationism all the same. McCarthy called it moral isolation. He believed it betrayed America's constitutional principles of accountable government while also harming America's standing in the world. Some issues just never go away. Today we have no shortage of challenges, foreign and domestic, to occupy our attention as a nation. But we have a new president who's facing up to them. On the global front, he is leading a strong foreign relations team, including Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Defense Secretary Robert Gates. There's a much larger emphasis on working with other nations through alliances and coalitions instead of always trying to be the Lone Ranger of the world. A few examples. The President successfully negotiated a new agreement with Russia on strategic nuclear arms control, which is now awaiting approval in Congress. He worked with other nations in responding to the global financial and economic crisis. He's worked with other nations to keep a unified front with economic sanctions against Iran. He's withdrawing combat troops from Iraq while refocusing on threats in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere. And finally, his actions have begun to repair Americans' reputation in the world, which is no small feat, even though we all know that there is much work that needs to be done. Now, Minnesota's approach to the world has also turned around since the isolationist days of Hendrik Shipstead and Harold Knudsen. You can see it in our economy, our educational institutions, and even in our homes and families. First, there's Minnesota's engagement with the world through international trade and commerce. Today, you can go practically anywhere in the world and find products made in our state, whether it's medical devices or soybeans or industrial machines or Post-it notes. Eugene.McCarthy was a firm believer in the unifying power of international commerce, where one country's economic interests are joined with those of another. He consistently supported legislation to expand America's trade in foreign markets. Minnesota had much to gain, and we did. Now, this may seem a little surprising since we're landlocked in the middle of a large continent, far away from most foreign markets, but Minnesotans weren't deterred. The 1959 opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in the Great Lakes was a watershed moment for our state's export economy. McCarthy predicted it would serve as a cosmopolitan link between the huge market region of the upper Midwest and the great ports of the world, and it did. By the Seaway's 50th anniversary in 2009, it had moved 2.5 billion tons of goods, valued at more than $375 billion. National farm policy and innovative companies like 3M, Cargill, and Medtronic has also helped to drive Minnesota's export success. Last year, Minnesota's exports, including manufacturing, agriculture, and the service sector, totaled around $28 billion. That's more than 10% of our state's economy. And I should note that just in this past year, while we are only 21st in population, we have gone from 9th to 7th in the country for Fortune 500 companies. And a lot of it had to do with that foresight in thinking about our role in the global marketplace. Now, we can do more. Earlier this year, the President put a challenge to the nation to double the number of exports, and I hope that our state can even do better. There is literally a world of opportunity out there. Think about it. 95% of the world's customers live outside the United States. With our 95%, with our educated workforce and innovative spirit, many Minnesota companies are building more and more markets overseas, and it isn't just St. Jude's and General Mills. I head up the Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Exports and Innovation, so as you can see, this is dear to my heart. And I know that some of the best opportunities to grow right now are for small and medium-sized businesses to get the tools that they need so they can get customers outside of our borders. I can see it in the St. Cloud area, where I recently met with a number of companies who are building their markets by exporting. Now, just to see what I'm talking about in today's world, there's a little company up in Carlstead, Minnesota, the moose capital of our state. Second time I used moose in this speech, probably the first lecture you had where someone did that twice. Population 794 people, and this company is called Matrax. It's named after a second grader. This little kid went home, drew a picture of his truck for his dad, and had put some little tank tracks on each of the wheels of the truck. And his dad said, "No, Matt, that's not how you do it. The tracks go between the wheels." And Matt said, "No, Dad, this would be better because you could take them off and put them back on." His dad's mechanic decides to design this thing and calls the company Matrax. Well, in 1995, when they started, Matrax had 6 people working for the company. One day they drove over to Fargo, met with the foreign commercial service people of the United States government's Commerce Department, and found out that there was a world of opportunity out there for their product. They entered it in the computer, they found out about new markets, and today Matrax employs 40 people and exports to Canada and 55 other countries, including Turkey, Russia, Chile, and Kazakhstan. I like to say that this company, in a population, town of 700 people, 40 people employed, does business from Carlstead to Kazakhstan. Or how about Maynard Ackerman outside of Austin, Minnesota, our own national, this is true, he was named the trenchless digger of the year. His factory in a southern Minnesota cornfield is now at 80 employees and growing. What does he do? He does trenchless digging, huge machinery that goes underground to build sewer, water systems without unearthing neighborhoods and people. Guess which countries are interested in that? China, India. So that is just some examples of what we can do as we build on that McCarthy, Mondale, Humphrey legacy of looking outside of our borders for business. Now, there's another way that Minnesota has engaged with the world, and that's through education. Here I refer to our students who take time to learn another language and study abroad. And I also refer to international students who come here to learn, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Not only at St. John's and St. Ben's, but many other Minnesota higher education institutions have among the highest percentage of students who study abroad. For example, the University of Minnesota campus ranks third in the nation among research institutions for the number of students who participate in an education experience abroad. It adds up to more than 2,500 students every single year. Learning a foreign language and going to study in another country not only broadens the mind of the individual student, it also broadens our own society, and it strengthens our ability to compete for business in countries around the world. I also want to highlight the importance of international students who come here to study. Right here on this campus, you have more than 260 international students from nearly 50 different countries. These students come here because of the high quality of education provided by America's colleges and universities. Many are here to study science or engineering. They are acquiring valuable knowledge and developing important talents that could make a substantial contribution to America's future prosperity. But right now there's a little bit of an issue. We have a system that basically invites the students to study here, and then once they graduate, unless they have an immediate job, we kick them out before the ink can even dry on their diplomas. We put a do not apply sign. Well, you know what they do? They go back to their own countries and they start the next Google over there instead of over here. As the president recently put it, we're training our competition. And this doesn't make any sense at all. As we deal with the difficult immigration issue, we must find a way to allow a kid who graduates from the University of Minnesota in engineering the opportunities to stay here so that someday she will be able to start the next Medtronic right here in Minnesota. Finally, I want to mention one other aspect of Minnesota's internationalism that I'm sure McCarthy would be proud of. That's international adoptions. In the past several decades, tens of thousands of Minnesotans have opened their homes to orphans from around the world and welcomed them into their families, many of them right in the St. Cloud area. For years, Minnesota has led all other states in our international adoption rate. The children have come from all around the world: Korea, Russia, Guatemala, Ethiopia, and Haiti. As a result of the devastating earthquake in Haiti early this year, there are tens of thousands of children who've been newly orphaned. But when the earthquake struck, there were already many Haitian children who were in the process of being adopted. In many cases, the adoptive parents had already met the child and were just waiting for the paperwork to be completed. Many waiting for years, having gone to Haiti, met these kids, have pictures of them. Of course, the earthquake struck panic in these parents. They wanted to know if the kids were safe, and they wanted to bring them to their new homes as quickly as possible. I work with Secretary of State Clinton and Homeland Security Secretary Napolitano, as well as with top officials in Haiti, to bring these children to the United States to their new families using a legal provision called humanitarian parole. I was also among the first group of members of Congress to actually go to Haiti and plead their case by talking with the Prime Minister of Haiti directly about these children. And I was so proud that when it all was done, we brought all of these kids, I think 39 of them, back to Minnesota that had pending adoptions. One of the happiest moments that I've had so far in the Senate, people always ask you that question, what are your happiest moments? because I think they think there's a lot of unhappy moments. And one of the happiest moments I had was when I was down in Pipestone. And we were down there on like a water meeting. It was getting kind of long. And at the end of the meeting, it was like 5 in the afternoon. And I remember the sun was streaming in the window. And there was this family standing there. And they were smiling. The dad had this big smile. This about 4-year-old girl was smiling. There was this little African-American boy, and the rest of the people were white in the family, held in his mother's arms, and the mom was just sobbing. And I thought, oh no, what is this about? So I just went over there and I said, can I help you? Because they'd clearly come to see me at the water meeting. And she could hardly speak, and she finally said, this little boy wouldn't be here without Callie Cruz of your office. And what had happened was that the family was adopting this baby in Ethiopia. The baby was deathly sick. They went over there just desperately trying to get him to America to get the right health care. And they were just caught up in red tape. And Callie got not only the baby back and the family back, and he was the happiest smiling kid I have ever seen. And actually, Callie is somewhere out there today in our crowd. So thank you, Callie, for that. On the legislative front in this area of international adoption, I was also pleased when we passed legislation in July that was inspired by families like some of the ones that you heard about with the Haiti case. The Adoptive Families Act, which I drafted and introduced with Mary Landrieu and Senator Jim Inhofe, Republican from Oklahoma, will allow more Minnesota families to actually adopt siblings that are 16 and 17. Otherwise, they split up the families and be able to bring them to this country. It's just one of the many ways in which Minnesotans have proven that living in the provinces doesn't mean you have to be provincial. As a man of the world who grew up in Watkins, Minnesota, Eugene.McCarthy proved it every day of his life. So McCarthy has much to teach us as an educated man and a man of the world, and his legacy of internationalism has lived on in our state. You see it in those little children, you see it in the business community that we have, and you see it really in the international spirit of so many people in our state, the students out there from St. Ben's and St. John's that are studying from other countries. I met someone today from Northern Ireland that was here, and then also those that go abroad to study. But there's one last area that I wanted to delve into in McCarthy's life that I think is so relevant to today's challenges and struggles in the political arena. And that is that McCarthy has much to teach us as a man of independent spirit. He was someone who knew his own mind, did his own thinking, and refused to sacrifice his intellectual honesty to partisan politics. Among McCarthy's heroes was Sir Thomas More, a man for all seasons, a man who was willing to stand alone against the king, a man who sacrificed his life rather than his intellectual integrity, a man whose strength of character would always rise to the occasion. In 1968, McCarthy rose to the occasion and challenged the power of his president, his party, and the pundits. But there was more to McCarthy's independent spirit than just this one act. His independence also extended to relations with his colleagues across the partisan aisle. Sometimes an independent spirit requires that you have the courage to stand alone. But there are other times when it requires the courage to stand with those you normally oppose. McCarthy had this courage too, and I would agree with him that bipartisanship should not be a dirty word. Some of you may have read the recent New Yorker article by George Packer on what he calls the broken Senate. Also, the current issue of Vanity Fair has a long article by veteran journalist Todd Purdom about what's wrong with Washington. They describe a political culture in Washington that is paralyzed by bitter partisanship. The diagnosis is accurate up to a point. After all, Congress has passed 2 landmark sweeping pieces of legislation this year on health care and Wall Street reform. But these are exceptions that prove the rule. Yes, times have changed. Eugene McCarthy served in Congress in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s at a time when there was a lot more diversity and divisions within each of the two parties than there is today, both for good and bad. Back then, the Republican Party included conservative Midwest Republicans and more moderate liberal Republicans from the Northeast and New England. In the Democratic Party, there were conservatives from the South and liberals from the northern, more industrial states. In these circumstances, the Senate Majority Leader and House Speaker could never count on all of their party members to vote the same way. So it was a practical necessity to look to members of the other party in order to get enough votes on a given piece of legislation. If you look back at some of the most important federal legislation of the past 50 years, we can see that it took leaders who were willing to set aside the partisan talking points and step over the party line, leaders who were independent and courageous enough to extend open hands across the aisle. A classic example is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Although it was introduced by President Kennedy and pushed forward, as you know, by President Johnson, it was vigorously opposed by Democratic senators from the South. Back then, they had a real old-fashioned sleep-in-the-Senate filibuster. It lasted 57 days. Ultimately, it took bipartisan leadership from Democratic Senator Mike Mansfield and Republican Senator Everett Dirksen to get this historic legislation through. It passed thanks to the votes of 46 Democratic senators and 27 Republican senators. Another example from 1964 is the legislation that created Medicare. At the time, the legislation faced strong opposition, and Senator Durnberger has studied this well, just as strong, if not stronger, than we faced with this year's health care reform bill. The American Medical Association, among others, called it socialized medicine. But in the end, it passed the Senate with 57 Democratic votes and 13 Republican votes. In the 1980s, bipartisan leadership was needed to save Social Security from insolvency. House Speaker Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, and Ronald Reagan were able to reach a compromise on what is often called the third rail of politics. They set up a bipartisan commission to make recommendations, and when actual legislation began to stall in Congress, Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan approached Republican Senator Bob Dole to try to work out a deal. And they did. In the end, 26 Democratic senators and 32 Republican senators joined together to get the bill passed. More recently, there was welfare reform in 1996 when President Clinton worked with a Republican-led Congress. It wasn't an easy road. Clinton vetoed two earlier versions of the bill that he believed failed to strike the right balance. In the end, the final conference report passed in the Senate with all 53 Republicans voting in favor, along with 25 Democrats. Compare this with today. Health care reform originally passed in December with a party line vote of 60 to 39. The final version, after reconciling with the House and the Massachusetts Senate election, passed on a vote of 56 to 43. And Wall Street reform passed 60 to 39 with just 4 Republicans in support. Today, a politician who bucks the party line is risking his political life. Take my good friend, and I really mean that, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. He voted to confirm both Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor. And what kind of response does he get? In his own state, he is attacked for being, quote, up to his old reach-across-the-aisle tricks again. Pundits scream that he deserves censure and an early retirement. In his floor speech supporting Sonia Sotomayor, Graham said, while I am not bound to vote for Judge Sotomayor, voting no would be the path of least political resistance for me. I choose to vote for her because she is well qualified. After criticizing how hyperpartisanship has infected the judicial confirmation process, he asked, what am I trying to do today? I am trying to start over. The political golden rule is do unto others as they did unto you. The actual golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I hope we can get back to the more traditional sense of what the Senate has been all about. Our country faces big issues, huge challenges, a sluggish economy, war, energy independence, a federal deficit. No one party acting alone can solve these problems, and no one party should have to. We can address these challenges in part by reforming some of the antiquated rules of the Senate. Walter Mondale, who reformed them in his own day, has made some good suggestions for our current problems to scrunch down the timetables, to do some things with the numbers. But we can truly address these challenges only if we have leaders who demonstrate a spirit of independence and dare to stand with members of the opposing party coming together for the good of the nation. So if Eugene McCarthy was standing here today, what would he say about the current state of affairs? No one could predict his reactions, of course. But if I could provide an educated guess, he would buck the conventional partisanship of our day and make endless fun of the tweets and the Twitters, perhaps in iambic pentameter. He would call for a more thoughtful and piercing discussion of the issues before us, and he would push for action. You know, my Senate seat used to belong to Eugene McCarthy, and it actually also belonged to Hubert Humphrey when he came back in 1971. Not everyone can say they have the seat that they both held. The two of them also served together in the Senate. We all know that they didn't always see eye to eye. They didn't always get along. Their political temperaments were very different. If Humphrey was the happy warrior, then maybe McCarthy was the contemplative warrior of American politics. But there is still something very fundamental that they shared. For all his sardonic humor and ironic cast of mind, Eugene McCarthy had a strong, optimistic streak. He believed that an educated, engaged citizenry could strengthen the pillars of democracy. He believed in the power and promise of science and innovation. He believed in America's endless capacity for good, for empowering people in nations across the globe. And most importantly, he believed in the intelligence, ingenuity, and basic human decency of the American people. As he said in a 1967 speech, the American spirit has a grand purpose and a clear prerogative. And these are his words: to offer in place of doubt, trust; in place of expediency, right judgment; in place of incredibility, integrity; in place of murmuring, let us have clear speech. Let us again hear America singing. In place of disunity, let us have dedication of purpose. In place of near despair, let us have hope. That was the American spirit that Eugene McCarthy treasured, a spirit defined by honesty, by integrity and grace, the principles that our country was built on, the principles that made us great, the principles that Eugene McCarthy cherished and that we all cherish today. So if I leave you with any words today, it is this simple idea: in place of murmuring, let us have clear speech. Let us again hear America singing. Thank you. Thank you. If you guys don't sit down, I'm going to call out Joe Rogers, who used to babysit when he was 2 years old. Okay, he had 5 brothers and sisters, and I was only 12 years old. This is, the 1970s, and I'm babysitting their family, and his brother Kevin flushed the entire family's toothbrushes down the toilet under my watch. So when I see him, it's sort of a memory of some challenges in my own life. All right, nothing can be harder than that. So I think we're going to have questions. Finally, I can see everyone out there. See, the problem with this is that you like to know what your audience and who's shaking their head yes and no before you call on the people to ask questions. But, now I can finally see you. I think we're going to take 5 or 6 questions here. So.
And is this working? Yeah, we have students over here and over here. So just kind of raise your hand. We'll take several questions.
Okay,
and
well,
please keep your questions brief. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So.
Oh, I think I'm okay. That's good. Oh, maybe that would be fun to sit there and get the microphone. Okay. Shoes were starting to hurt. Okay, well, let's see. Maybe we can, are you guys going to decide? Oh, they decide, not me. That's so funny. I wanted to start with maybe a woman student. I was going to pick you. That's really weird. Okay.
Thank you so much for being here, Senator Klobuchar, and for your leadership for our state. My name's Anna Schumacher. I'm a 2010 grad of the College of St. Benedict and an econ major. So my question is this. U.S. tax dollars subsidize and support an agricultural policy of monoculture and cheap food. These subsidies give U.S. super producers like ADM and Monsanto an artificial economic advantage on the global market at the expense of our health, the environment, and the livelihoods of our neighbors in developing countries. What is your vision for innovation in agriculture in Minnesota and our nation?
Okay, well, thank you for starting with such a softball. Let me first explain that I am on the Agriculture Committee, so this is near and dear to my heart. I spent a lot of time going around our state focusing on this issue of agriculture. I don't know if you guys know, we're #1 in the country for turkeys, true story, and we're #6 for honey. I just did an event with our honey producers today because we're experiencing honey laundering from foreign countries. They're taking our honey and messing us up. Okay, let me get to your question. It's a really interesting issue. The issue is this. Our rural parts of our state are incredibly important to our state, and I always have believed that kids that grow up in rural Minnesota should be able to live and farm in Minnesota. The farming community throughout the last few decades have had some enormous challenges, and it's not just weather, it's volatile prices, it's some unfair trade situations. And the one thing I don't want to become, if you talk about international involvement, is a country that is as dependent on foreign food as we are dependent on foreign oil. We have to have our own food in this country. So when you talk about the farm policy and the farm bill, the first thing you need to know is that farm bill is actually more of that money goes to nutrition, for school lunch programs, for food stamps, than it ever goes to the safety net for our farmers. So I actually am a proponent of making sure we have that safety net in place. Again, because I do not want to end up where we are in the energy area, where we start losing all of our market, our farm market, whether it's small organic farms, whether it is dairy farms in Minnesota, or whether it's corn crops. I don't want to be losing that market and having us dependent on some other country. So I think that's very important. In terms of innovation as we go forward, we have the basic foods that's important, but there is also huge potential in terms of energy and in terms of conservation and other things that our farmers can offer. In the energy area, and I know that not everyone probably in this room is a fan of biofuels, but it is a very important part of our energy makeup. Ethanol is at its beginnings, but there is so much more we can do as we go forward with cellulosic ethanol, switchgrass, algae, you name it. There's a guy in southern Minnesota that every time I see him, he shows me a laptop because he has this plan of how we're going to get rid of our addiction to foreign oil by simply planting switchgrass in all of our highway medians across the country. And as I drive down the highways, I always wonder, would that be dangerous? Like you couldn't see anything? But it is actually not as funny as it sounds, because we need to move ahead with new ideas for energy. And some of this is biomass in our state, whether it's residue from logging, whether it is other forms of using our land and conserving our land in different ways. So that's in the mix as well when we look at innovation. But this is a very important part of our economy in Minnesota. When you look at, during the middle of this economic downturn, why our state is doing better than so many other states, while it's nowhere near where we want to be, we're at 6.8% unemployment. We're a full 2 points below the national average. A lot of it has to do with our strong farm community, our #1 export, employing so many people from sugar beet. I know there's some sugar beet people out there. Sugar beet growers up, in fact, they're in the front row. Sugar beets in western and northern Minnesota to those beekeepers that I was with today. And so we want to make sure that part of our economy continues strong, because it's not just our big corporations, which are so important that I mentioned in the speech, and our small businesses. It's also that farm economy. So I think keeping it strong, looking at some of these new potentials for energy, and then I would add, which I talked about in the speech, making, if you want to talk about innovation, looking at export possibilities for our farmers is going to be key, so we can work to help feed the world as well with some of our crops. So thank you for the question. I was hoping you'd give it to the woman who interned in our office last summer. I thought that would be a real easy one for me, but I won't point out who she is. Maybe I will later. Like for one more question.
Senator Klobuchar, I know so many creative and curious youth who would add so much to your ideals for education if the DREAM Act was passed. Could you explain your position and just help me understand it a little more?
Sure. I am supportive of the DREAM Act, and I have voted for it before. All right. I mean, I think it's very important. It's sort of along the same lines that I talked to make sure that we tap into all the talent. It will allow states to make some of their own decisions about funding, but would at least allow these kids to go to school.
Hello, Senator. My name is Nick Moe, and I'm a sustainability fellow here and a student at School of Theology.
Are you the one responsible for these nifty green things that they had me up here?
Partly.
The sustainability green message
Along
of
with
St.
Theo
John's?
here. Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you. I felt like I had product placement up there while I was speaking. I just want people to know that wasn't my choice there, but it's very nice. It's very nice.
So I find that this discourse about other countries passing us by to be a little disturbing, not because we're losing, but because it seems like there's an us versus them mentality that we should be always the superpower of the world. Shouldn't we be embracing the progress of the fellow members of our one human family on this earth and embrace those opportunities for collaboration? Because it seems like that our need for exports is dependent on that.
Well, obviously, I think a lot of my speech was devoted to this idea of embracing these other countries, pointing out what the president has done in terms of trying to work with other countries. I think that's key. But I do want to make out the point is we are still here in the United States of America, and we have to be honest about the international competition that we're facing. And this doesn't mean that we want to beat them to the ground. We actually want their economies to be strong so that they can buy our goods. But we have to be honest about the fact that we are falling behind in terms of education and in terms of some of our exports and manufacturing. And that my first priority, I'll be honest, is the people of our state. And I want to make sure that the kids that are my daughter's age are going to be able to have jobs when they get out there in the workforce. As many kids that are here in this room know very much what I'm talking about, that they're struggling. And one of the ways we do that is actually to engage with the rest of the world, to not just think we're going to be able to grow our economy the old way, that we're going to have to grow it by looking for these markets. To so many small businesses right now, the statistic is that 30% small businesses say that they would export if they could figure out how to do it. To many of them, this is like an ancient map where the world and the countries haven't been filled in yet. And that has to change so that they can access those markets and they can figure out where they can find new customers. So that's what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about engaging with the rest of the world, and if we do it for our own competitive advantage, that better be one of our goals, because we've got to employ the people in this country and we have to move ahead as a country. And could I also add, I think one of the things that's lacking in our political dialogue that Senator Dernberger and I have talked at length about is kind of a unifying force. What's bringing us together right now when people are so divided? And I truly believe that this idea of a competitive agenda, and some of people may not like the word competitive, but it's true, a competitive agenda, an innovation agenda, if that makes it easier for you to swallow, is something that can bring people together as we look at what defines us. How do we want to make decisions on government policy? How do we want to make decisions about, well, why should we put funding into student loans? Why should we do that? Well, we want to be nice, we want kids to do well, but we also want to be able to have our country do well. Why do we want to have a health care system that delivers health care at affordable rates? Because we're not going to be able to compete on the international stage in any way if our businesses are loaded down with huge health care bills and not able to compete with other countries that have more efficient delivery systems. So I think why do we want to have our own energy? Because we want to be able to compete in an economic basis. And there are other reasons, moral reasons, other reasons that I'm sure Eugene McCarthy would give, but I do think that it's important as we look at how we bring people together as opposed to dividing them, that this economic argument is one way that I believe works. If I can talk the same way in front of 1,200 employees at 3M that I talk in front of a Democratic caucus in Minneapolis, I think that it's maybe a little bit of a trick, that it's a unifying theme that brings people together.
Senator Klobuchar,
where are you?
My question goes back.
Oh, you're up there.
Hi.
Hi.
My question goes back to earlier in your speech when you're speaking about how these nations like China and India are surpassing us in education. Mm-hmm. And I'm starting my sophomore year here, and I can't help but wonder two things. One, what is it that is making these students in India, China, these other nations better than us? What are they doing that's obviously working for them and not for us? And two, what can I do to make myself better than them in the coming years?
Okay, well, first of all, man, he really took this to heart. Okay, first of all, I did not say that they are better than us. They are not. Like, we have some of the best students in the world. We still, I believe, have led the world in innovation and will lead the world in innovation. So don't get me wrong on that. But I believe, first of all, some countries have made a bigger effort, a more, I'd say, organized effort, and they are more unified in a political sense, whether it's because of the way their system works, systems we may not like, or it's because their political leaders have decided we need to come together on this, but they have made this education a huge priority, and I think we need to do that in this country. As you know what it's like to be loaded down by these student loans. We've done some on this in Washington. I think we have to do more. I have a little sense of this. I remember paying off my student loans, having just paid them off, which in today's dollars probably seems small. And then I met my husband, and he had $50,000 of student loans, but I married him anyway. So I had a little sense of having gone through this twice, what this is like. And I think that's a key to this, as well as making this a priority. And then the other thing I briefly mentioned was when research goes on in universities, to not let it fall into what's called the valley of death, where it just sits on a shelf in a university laboratory, and that we make it easier to take that research to market. In the old days, we had the Bell Labs and things like that, so that we get these ideas into action and actually bring them into the marketplace.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you for being here tonight.
Sure.
My name is Ashley Verberg, and I'm a class of 2010 alumna.
Okay.
And I have a question for you that relates back to, I heard you speaking today on NPR about the importance of bipartisan efforts, and we touched on that a little bit tonight. But speaking from the perspective of a recent graduate at a college that focuses on the liberal arts and the importance of critical thinking, a lot of us are working to shape our political, religious, philosophical identities. And of course, we have our friends that are on the far left and are on the far right. But for me, I think the majority of my friends lie in the middle when it comes to politics. And something that's been really challenging is identifying with a political party in particular. And I guess what my question for you is, for those of us that are trying to define ourselves and our political identities and to identify with a party, what would you advise in the spirit of moving forward as Eugene J. McCarthy would have guided in bipartisan efforts for us?
Okay. I thought you were going to ask how would I advise which party you join. I thought that would be kind of an amusing question. Okay, so, let me say this, and that is that I think that's a very good question, and it's a complicated answer, and I touched on it only because I thought maybe we would get some questions on it, which I'm glad that we did. And the first piece of it is how we get more bipartisanship going, how we get people working together. And some people say, oh, bipartisanship is dead, who cares about it? Well, it can't be dead in the United States Senate. This has been an institution, it's been around for a while, and it has some set rules. There are rules that I think we can change to make it work a little better, but that in the end it cries out for leadership. And let me first start with some of the changes I think would be helpful. The way the filibuster rule works, you've all heard of it now, you need 60 votes to overcome the filibuster, and it's meant to slow things down. That's why it was created in the first place, because the Senate gives more rights to the party that's not in power, and it allows issues to be debated, and it was put in there for good reasons. But the way it's been played with now, used more than any time in history, it cries out for change. One of the changes that Walter Mondale has actually suggested is at least trimming down the time for what's called a motion to proceed. So this is how it works in the Senate. You can only have one issue up at a time unless the other party consents. Maybe you'll vote on a judge where there's only one person against it in the middle, but basically you can only have one issue that's on the floor. So say Wall Street reform took 2 months and then you couldn't do other things. And people go, well, why didn't you get the food safety bill passed that time? Well, unless you have unanimous consent to go forward, you're on one issue for 2 months. And all of these sort of pressure points when you have motions to proceed are governed by this filibuster rule. So if you want to go to debate, that takes a week to debate it, then you go to the next step. So one idea is to at least get rid of using the filibuster for some of those points leading up to the actual debate. And that would really help, especially for some of the middle-sized bills that we have. Another thing, which is in a Norman Ornstein column from over the weekend, is to simply require that these 40 people that are objecting show up and have to transparently show that they want to stand up and say, because right now they don't really have to do that they have to say, no, I don't want to vote on this right now. I can vote however I want, but I don't even want to vote on it. I think that would be very helpful for the public to see and to know that goes on. There are things you can do to reduce the number of people. When Mondo came in, he reduced from 67 to 60 the number of senators that could basically are required for the filibuster to block a vote. Another thing that's particularly concerning right now is something called the secret hold. And when I came in, our class came in, we actually thought we got rid of it. We said you could only do it for 3 days, and then you had to be public about it. Well, guess what some people are doing? They do it for 3 days, and then like a relay race, they hand it over to another senator who then hands it back to them, and you can never say who's holding up a bill or who's holding up a nomination. And that can be done by both sides. And I think it's an absolute outrage, because I think people have a right to know. Some of these things get held for months, and when the vote comes, it's 90 to 10. Okay, these are not the hot button things that you might think, but there might be 1 or 2 senators with special interests who are trying to hold things up. And I just don't think that's the way we should run a democracy. So those are some procedural ideas that are out there that I'm hopeful in the new Congress in the next year, that's when you can sort of set some new rules, we will be able to make some changes. The second piece of this, which I think is a much sort of more not as concrete, but much more important, is just that courage and leadership to work on issues. Some of this is going to come from all of you, people who are just demanding action, who after this election, exercise your own rights, whoever you want to vote for, get this thing done, but that says we actually want you to get some things done right now, because we can't just keep our heads in the sand and stay where we are and not get some of these issues tackled. I think the deficit on down, and I think that is something that's going to be very important. There is actually a number of good people on both sides of the aisle, and I can tell you that there are actually really good relationships among senators. There are some senators that say this is actually one of the best times for personal friendships across the aisle. Now that must sound hilarious to all of you right now, but it is true. I have dinner with Lindsey Graham more than once a month, the two of us. I have just this week talked to John McCain on the phone. I talked to another Republican senator today. These are true relationships. And for me, because maybe I'm not that senior, I'm able to work with other people very easily on sort of, I'd say, mid-level bills, like the adoption one that I mentioned earlier that passed through the Senate, or the one that we just actually got signed into law on formaldehyde, which was supported by consumer groups, health groups, and the timber industry, to say that you can't have a timber coming over that doesn't meet certain health standards. I did that with Senator Crapo from Idaho, the Republican senator. So those things are happening all the time. But the issue is, for me, what I see is despite these people that can get along, except maybe at the most senior levels all the time, what happens is once they are put out there, basically on TV, I'll be honest, and the change from McCarthy's day is you now have the national cables 24/7. And I'm not even picking out one cable show. It can be cable shows on the left or the right. And people go on there, and unless you go to your base, you get in huge trouble because you get pushed. If you say you want to compromise one way, Lindsey Graham was one example of that, but it happens all the time. And I have thought about how do you get through this when in fact there's personal relationships there, but people are so afraid of losing their whole base by simply crossing over and working together on something. I had one crazy idea that if you took three talk show hosts, maybe one from Fox, one from CNN, or in the middle, one from MSNBC, and they would all agree every week or month on two senators, Republican and Democrat, that actually worked together and got something done. And then they would all go on each of their shows. And it would just be symbolic, but it would be this idea that we need to start focusing on action and getting things done, and that there is value in that kind of compromise and activity. And I just think that in the end, as I said earlier, we can't put our heads in the sand. We have to think anew and act anew. And I'll believe we get through this. Just when I went through that stories of all those bills through time, can you imagine how heated that civil rights debate was? But somehow they got that done. So I refuse just to be glum about this, because I think we will get through this. As Senator Dernberger noted, we will have a new kind of politics in the Senate and in the country. But I think we're not going to be able to get there without the people of this country demanding that new kind of politics.